I never imagined I'd become the most hated resident in an entire homeowners association. But when they blocked my pathway to the dock and smirked at my protests, I decided to orchestrate a strategic battle they never anticipated. Today, from my personal waterfront dock, I'm enjoying a refreshing beverage while observing dozens of HOA members standing helplessly by the water's edge. Unable to fish during the exclusive fishing season of the year, a cherished tradition that has thrived in this neighborhood for over 4 decades. Sometimes vindication isn't just delivered in legal chambers, but on your own property with strategic legal expertise and tremendous perseverance. By the way, which location are you viewing this content from? Leave a comment down below because this narrative is about to become far more captivating than you could imagine. When Emma and I made the decision to purchase her deceased grandfather's waterfront estate at Lakeside Shores, we were mainly attracted by the sentimental connection and the personal dock that had existed there for over 6 decades. As a freelance IT specialist with a love for angling, the prospect of strolling down to my private dock whenever desired felt like paradise realized. The residence required renovation, but that aged wooden pier extending into the crystal-clear lake waters was flawless exactly as it stood. I recall standing there the afternoon we finalized the purchase, observing a small bass leap near one of the support beams, and believing I had discovered my personal sanctuary. Emma's grandfather had constructed that dock using his own labor back in the early 60s, assembling each board with meticulous attention. There were still weathered initials etched into one of the foundation posts, his signature that had endured decades of sunshine, storms, and gentle waves. For Emma, it represented a tangible link to her childhood memories of summers spent angling with her grandfather. For me, it symbolized the ideal refuge from the technological world I inhabited daily, a location where devices disappeared and wilderness became paramount. The initial 2 weeks were heavenly. I established my home workspace overlooking the water and completed work early to spend the afternoons fishing from the dock. Our neighbors appeared sufficiently welcoming, though many were temporary residents. We received greeting packages from several of them, including an especially thoughtful one from Victor Ramirez, a former military serviceman who resided 3 houses away. "Pleasant to have some permanent residents relocating here," he said with a sincere smile when he delivered it. "This location transforms dramatically during the summer season." The neighborhood had this yearly angling celebration that everyone discussed. Apparently, it had been occurring for 40 years and was the centerpiece of their summer. Visitors from surrounding communities would arrive. There would be a major fishing contest with prizes valued at thousands of dollars, and the entire community would unite for a week of festivities. Local merchants established booths selling everything from custom-made lures to freshly caught fish tacos. Children would engage in fishing workshops, learning correct methods and conservation concepts. During the evenings, there would be live entertainment and dancing on the community lawn. Everyone I encountered mentioned it within moments of meeting, their expressions brightening as they described their preferred aspects or previous champions of the competition. I was enthusiastic about experiencing my first one, already envisioning myself competing in the base category of the tournament. Then arrived the correspondence, an official notification from the Lakeside Shores Homeowners Association informing me that my dock violated HOA guidelines and required removal within 30 days. I was astonished. The dock had existed since 1962, long before the HOA was established in 1990. I contacted the number provided on the letterhead and connected with Eleanor Blackwood, the HOA president. "I comprehend your concern, Mr. Turner," she said in a tone that indicated she comprehended nothing of the kind. "But our guidelines explicitly state that all waterfront structures must comply with current architectural standards. Your grandfather-in-law's dock was technically non-compliant, but grandfathered as a pre-existing structure. However, since the property has transferred ownership, we need to bring it into compliance." I explained that the dock was structurally sound and predated their organization. "Surely there must be some protection for pre-existing structures," I reasoned. Her response was a dismissive chuckle. "This isn't constitutional law, Mr. Turner. This is Lakeside Shores. Our covenants are quite explicit, and I recommend you examine them thoroughly. The 30-day countdown is ticking." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, the tone of someone who had become comfortable exercising power without opposition. I attempted another approach, explaining the sentimental significance of the dock to my wife's family, how her grandfather had built it decades earlier. While I appreciate family sentiments, Eleanor replied with manufactured sweetness, the HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards. Personal attachments to non-compliant structures are unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant. Perhaps you could capture some photographs before removing it. For the memories. I felt my blood pressure increasing but kept my voice calm. I'll be examining the HOA bylaws and relevant state laws before taking any action, I replied. Her sigh was dramatic. As you wish, Mr. Turner. But I should caution you, fighting the HOA rarely concludes favorably for homeowners. That evening, while contemplating what to do next, I happened to be carrying some refuse to the containers at the end of our driveway when I overheard voices from the street. Eleanor was walking with a man I would later identify as Marcus Reed, a fellow HOA board member. They had stopped just beyond my property line and were speaking in hushed but audible tones. I don't care about heritage or whatever, Eleanor complained, gesturing toward my property. That dock obstructs the view from my living room windows. Besides, we need the space for the new fishing pier for this year's festival. Marcus nodded in agreement, and they continued down the road, unaware I had heard everything. And that's when I understood this wasn't about regulations. This was territorial warfare. And unfortunately for Eleanor, I was very skilled at strategy. The following morning, I immersed myself in research. I've always believed that knowledge is power, and in this situation, I needed all the power I could obtain. I cleared my work schedule for the day, prepared a large pot of coffee, and set up multiple monitors to organize my discoveries. I downloaded every HOA document I could locate, studied state property laws, requested the original property deeds from the county records office, and reached out to several contacts who might have insights into local regulation. Emma brought me lunch at my desk, concerned about my intense focus, but supportive of my determination to fight for her grandfather's legacy. I remember him saying once that he made sure to obtain all the proper permits when he built that dock, she mentioned. He was always meticulous about those things. That comment sent me down another research path looking for historical building permits in county archives. By late afternoon, I had discovered a crucial detail. According to state law, structures built before an HOA's establishment were indeed protected under what's called grandfathered status. More importantly, I learned about riparian rights, the legal rights of property owners to access and use bodies of water adjacent to their land. These weren't just casual guidelines. They were well-established principles in property law with significant legal precedent backing them. I also spent time learning about the annual fishing festival that meant so much to this community. It wasn't just a casual gathering. It was a significant economic and cultural event for Lakeside Shores. Families who had been participating for generations planned their entire summers around it. The week-long celebration included a fishing competition with substantial prizes, children's activities, communal cookouts, and even a small parade. Looking through the local historical society's online archives, I found photographs dating back to the early 1980s, smiling families holding up impressive catches, children with faces painted like fish, elderly anglers sharing techniques with youngsters. There was even a Lakeside Legends Award given annually to the community member who had done the most to preserve the lake's heritage and ecology. Local businesses counted on the tourism boost with restaurants, tackle shops, and lodging facilities making nearly 30% of their annual revenue during festival week. For many year-round residents, it was the primary way they connected with their neighbors and maintained the sense of community through the quieter winter months. The festival had weathered economic downturns, changing demographics, and even a major flood in 1997. It was the beating heart of Lakeside Shores, a tradition that transcended the typical neighborhood get-together. During my research, I found an ally, Walter Graham, a 72-year-old retired attorney who lived a few doors down. When I explained my situation, he invited me over for coffee. Walter's house was painted a striking navy blue that stood out among the beige and gray homes typical of the neighborhood. Eleanor tried to make me repaint this house 5 years ago, he chuckled, pouring me a strong cup of coffee laced with what I suspect was a splash of whiskey. Said it violated the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. I showed her the original HOA documents that had no color restrictions when I bought the place. She wasn't happy, but she couldn't do a thing about it. Walter confirmed my findings about grandfathered structures and riparian rights. He also helped me locate the original property documents, proving the dock had been built in 1962. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal response to the HOA, refusing to remove the dock and attaching the legal evidence supporting my position. I had barely hit send on the email when my phone rang. It was a neighbor I had met briefly, Sophia Lynn. "Charles, I heard about your dispute with Eleanor," she said. "I just wanted to warn you. She doesn't take challenges well. When my family installed solar panels last year, she made our lives miserable for months, even though they were completely legal. Just be prepared, okay?" 3 days later, I received another letter from the HOA, this one notifying me of an emergency board meeting to discuss my ongoing violations. The tone was clear. Eleanor was rallying her forces. I asked Walter if he would accompany me to the meeting, and he agreed with a gleam in his eye that suggested he relished the opportunity. As we prepared to leave for the meeting, Walter patted my shoulder, a mischievous smile appearing on his weathered face. "You know, Eleanor tried to make me repaint my house 5 years ago. She didn't like the navy blue, and now my house is even bluer. Sometimes, Charles, the HOA battle isn't about winning the first fight, it's about winning the last one." I had no idea this was just the prelude to what was coming, but I had decided not to merely defend. I needed to attack. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center, a single-story building with walls covered in photos from past fishing festivals. Emma and I arrived with Walter, finding the room already packed with about 30 residents. Eleanor sat at the center of a long table at the front, flanked by 5 board members, including Marcus Reed. She didn't bother to hide her displeasure when she saw Walter beside me. "This emergency meeting of the Lakeside Shores HOA is now in session," Eleanor announced, banging a small gavel. "Our first and only agenda item concerns the Turner property and its non-compliant dock structure. Mr. Turner has refused to comply with our reasonable request to remove the structure, citing what he believes are grandfathered rights." I noticed how she emphasized "believes" as if my legal rights were merely an opinion. When it was my turn to speak, I presented the documents Walter had helped me find, explaining clearly that the dock predated the HOA by nearly 30 years and was protected under state law. Several residents nodded in agreement, but Eleanor remained unmoved. "While Mr. Turner's historical research is interesting," she said with a dismissive wave, "the fact remains that the HOA has full control over common areas, including the walkway access to all docks. The board has determined that the walkway to Mr. Turner's dock crosses HOA property and presents a safety issue." This was a new angle I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't attacking the dock itself anymore, but my access to it. Marcus then presented a property map showing that while my dock extended from my land, the most convenient walkway to it crossed about 6 feet of common ground. Eleanor called for a vote on installing a safety fence that would effectively block my access to my own dock. With the exception of one elderly board member named Victor Ramirez, who abstained, the vote passed unanimously. "The HOA will install appropriate safety barriers within the week," Eleanor announced with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Turner can keep his dock. He just won't be able to use it." As the meeting wrapped up, I approached Brian Mitchell, the property manager tasked with installing the fence. "I've never seen them go this far before," he admitted quietly. "Usually Eleanor just issues fines until people give up. This is different." That evening, I drafted a formal complaint to the County Land Management Office alleging abuse of power by the HOA in violation of my riparian rights of access. I detailed how the HOA was using safety concerns as a pretext to block lawful access to my water rights. I also learned that Eleanor had been pushing for a new community fishing pier for years, one that would be built near her property, but designed not to block her lake view. 3 days later, I stood watching as Brian and his crew erected a metal fence blocking the path to my dock. Eleanor stood nearby, the triumph evident on her face. "I told you that you couldn't win," she whispered as she walked past me. She thought she had won. What Eleanor didn't know was that I had just received an email from the County Land Management Office containing information that would likely wipe that smile off her face very quickly. The email from the county land management office confirmed they had received my complaint and were reviewing it. Logan Parker, a land management specialist, requested a meeting to discuss the situation further. When we met at his office the following day, he spread out several maps on his desk showing the property boundaries around the lake. "This is interesting," Logan said, pointing to the shoreline. "According to county records, Lakeside Shores HOA doesn't actually own the entire lakefront. The lake itself and a 16-foot shoreline buffer are state property managed under the Department of Natural Resources. The HOA has been granted certain usage rights, but they don't have the authority they think they do." This was valuable information, but I needed more. I spent the next week conducting thorough research on Eleanor and the HOA board. I discovered that Eleanor had been president for 15 years, running unopposed most of that time. More interestingly, I found business records showing that Eleanor had a financial relationship with Lakeview Construction, the same company that had been awarded the contract to build the new community fishing pier. I organized an informal meeting with several disgruntled homeowners, including Sophia Lynn and George Winters, an elderly resident who had been forced to remove his beloved garden after a prolonged battle with the HOA. We gathered at Walter's Navy Blue House to share information. "Eleanor has been playing this game for years," said Isabel Rodriguez, a former HOA board member who had resigned in protest. "She enforces rules selectively, depending on whether she likes you or if it benefits her somehow." I left the board when I discovered she was directing HOA maintenance contracts to her brother-in-law's company without proper bidding. Meanwhile, the HOA increased my daily fine to $250, citing the continuing violation clause in their bylaws. The pressure was mounting, but so was my determination. The Land Management Office sent a warning letter to the HOA regarding potential overreach, requiring them to respond within 14 days. Their response was legally weak but stubborn. They maintained that the fence was for safety purposes and refused to remove it. By now, I was convinced that Eleanor's interest in removing my dock was connected to her plans for the new fishing pier. I just needed to figure out how. I contacted the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, to learn about fishing regulations on the lake and discovered something that would change everything. As I read through the documents Logan provided, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Not only was there a business relationship between Eleanor and the construction company, but there was also something that had been kept secret in all the HOA meetings. The lakeside wasn't HOA property. It was public property under state management. And according to state law, if a body of water was designated as a breeding area for certain fish species, I smiled, remembering the bass I often spotted near my dock every spring. This could be the card I needed. Eleanor had underestimated her opponent. While she was increasing my fines, I had found my heavy artillery. The next day, I reached out to Daniel Ortiz, an aquatic biologist at the local university who specialized in freshwater fish populations. His name had come up in my research as the author of several papers on bass habitats in regional lakes. Getting through to him wasn't easy. I had to navigate the university's labyrinthine phone system, leave messages with 2 different department assistants, and finally send a detailed email explaining my observations about the base near my dock. To my surprise, he called me back within an hour of receiving my email. "Your timing is interesting, Mr. Turner," he said when we connected. "I've been monitoring bass populations in several lakes in the region, and Lakeside has shown some unique patterns." I explained my situation and asked if he would be willing to conduct a survey of the area around my dock. I was upfront about my conflict with the HOA, but emphasized my genuine concern about protecting the lake ecosystem. Daniel was initially hesitant, not wanting to be drawn into a neighborhood dispute, but his scientific curiosity won out when I described the consistent patterns of bass activity I'd observed. "Those behaviors are consistent with spawning activity," he admitted. "If there is a significant breeding ground there, it would certainly be worth documenting." Curious about the potential ecological importance of the site, he agreed to meet me that weekend. Saturday morning found us in wet suits, conducting an underwater survey of the lake bottom around my dock. The water was clearer than I expected, with visibility extending about 15 feet in the early morning light. Daniel was methodical, taking photographs and samples while I assisted, holding measurement tools and collection bags. He pointed out features I would have missed: the specific composition of the gravel beds, the way aquatic plants were distributed, the small depressions in the lake bottom that he identified as base nests or redds. He collected water samples at various depths, measuring temperature, oxygen levels, and pH with portable instruments he'd brought. I was impressed by his thoroughness and expertise. This wasn't just a cursory look, but a proper scientific survey. After several hours of work, we emerged from the water, our arms laden with sample containers and equipment. As we climbed onto the dock, I was startled to see Marcus Reed standing on the shore, phone in hand, his expression a mixture of suspicion and concern. "What are you doing?" he demanded, clearly reporting back to Eleanor in real time. "Scientific research," Daniel replied pleasantly, continuing to catalog his samples. Once Marcus left, Daniel turned to me with excitement in his eyes. "Charles, your dock is situated over what appears to be a significant spawning ground for spotted bass. See these gravel beds? The water temperature and oxygen levels here are ideal for base reproduction. This is almost certainly a critical breeding habitat. This was exactly what I had hoped to find." Daniel explained that under state environmental regulations, construction or disruption of designated fish spawning grounds was strictly controlled. Any development near such areas required special permits and environmental impact assessments. I asked if the proposed fishing pier location would impact the spawning grounds, and Daniel confirmed it almost certainly would. Armed with this information, I contacted Rachel Morgan, an inspector with the Department of Natural Resources. I shared Daniel's preliminary findings and expressed concern about the planned pier construction. Rachel was immediately interested and arranged to conduct an official survey. "If this is confirmed as a spotted base spawning ground, it would automatically trigger protection measures," she explained. "That could affect any construction plans in the vicinity." I also met with Henry Wilson, a 75-year-old who had been fishing the lake for over 50 years. He confirmed that the area near my dock had always been known as a good base fishing spot and shared his concerns about how the new pier might affect the fish population. "Those bass are what make our annual fishing festival special," Henry explained. "If we damage their breeding grounds, the whole ecosystem could suffer. The fishing wouldn't be the same." The HOA responded to the initial warning letter from the Land Management Office with a legally weak but stubborn justification. They maintained the fence was for safety purposes and refused to remove it. Meanwhile, they increased my daily fine to $250, citing the continuing violation clause in their bylaws. I filed a formal complaint with the DNR requesting an environmental assessment of the proposed fishing pier and protection for the spawning area. I was taking a risk. If the assessment didn't confirm the spawning grounds, I'd lose credibility. But I was confident in Daniel's expertise. When Daniel and I surfaced from the water after our final survey, I saw Marcus standing on the shore, phone in hand. Our eyes met, and I knew I'd been discovered. "You know Eleanor won't let this go," Daniel said as we climbed ashore. I nodded but wasn't worried. "That's exactly what I'm counting on," I replied, "because Eleanor is about to face something she can't control. Mother Nature's laws and the fury of an entire community when they realize who's really threatening their traditional fishing festival." Within a week, the Department of Natural Resources temporarily suspended the permit for the new fishing pier pending their investigation. The official notice came by certified mail to both the HOA and me personally, a formal document with a state seal that detailed the reasons for the suspension and outlined the investigative process that would follow. It cited potential violations of the State Environmental Protection Act, specifically sections related to aquatic habitats and endangered species protection. The suspension notice was posted at the proposed construction site, a stark white sign with bold black lettering that was impossible to miss from the community walking path. The news spread through the community like wildfire, with various versions of the story circulating, some wildly inaccurate. Eleanor wasted no time calling another emergency HOA meeting, this one even more heated than the last. The community center was so packed that some residents had to stand along the walls, and the air conditioning struggled to keep up with the number of bodies in the room. The tension was palpable even before the meeting officially began, with neighbors who had been friendly for years now sitting on opposite sides of the room, exchanging wary glances. "Mr. Turner has taken it upon himself to sabotage a community project that would benefit everyone," she announced to the packed room. "His selfish actions may cost us our annual fishing festival, all because he refuses to comply with reasonable HOA regulations. The accusation was clever. She was attempting to turn the community against me by connecting my actions to the potential loss of their beloved festival. Many residents looked at me with open hostility, unaware that the real threat to the fish population came from Eleanor's poorly planned pier project. The HOA board, under Eleanor's direction, voted to increase my daily fine to $500, citing Article 12.3 of their bylaws regarding actions causing serious harm to community interests. The vote wasn't unanimous this time. Victor abstained again, and Harold Schmidt, the elderly board member, actually voted against it after asking several pointed questions about the legality of such a severe penalty. Eleanor quickly overruled his concerns, citing emergency powers granted to the board president in the bylaws. They also voted to suspend my access to community amenities, including the clubhouse and pool, and even went so far as to deactivate our key fobs to the gated parking areas and tennis courts. Deborah Collins, the HOA secretary, looked uncomfortable as she recorded these decisions in the official minutes, her pen hesitating several times as Eleanor dictated the wording. Through it all, Eleanor maintained a veneer of procedural correctness, but the vindictive intent was obvious to everyone present. She was using every tool at her disposal to pressure me into submission, hoping that the financial burden and social isolation would force me to back down. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, standing up after the vote, "have you informed the community about your business relationship with Lakeview Construction, or about the fact that the environmental impact assessment for the new pier was never completed?" A hush fell over the room. Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "That's completely irrelevant and potentially slanderous. Mr. Turner, this meeting is adjourned." She banged her gavel and quickly exited the room, but I could see I had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of several residents. I decided to take my case directly to the community. I posted on the local community forum sharing information about the base spawning grounds and the potential environmental impact of the proposed pier. I was careful to frame my concern as being about the future sustainability of fishing in the lake rather than just my personal battle with the HOA. As tensions rose, I received notice that the DNR would conduct a comprehensive environmental assessment of the lake area. Eleanor's lawyer sent me a threatening letter claiming I was unlawfully interfering with HOA projects and could face legal action. When I read the threat letter from Eleanor's lawyer, Emma asked worriedly if we should back down. I set the letter aside and opened my laptop, showing her an email I had just received. "It's from the DNR," I said. "They're not just suspending the pier project, they're expanding their investigation to include all HOA activities related to the lake over the past 5 years." Emma looked at me, eyes wide. "But this means—" "That's right," I nodded. "Eleanor has dug her own grave, and I haven't even played my strongest card yet, telling the community about the real threat to their beloved fishing festival." Henry organized a meeting with fishing enthusiasts in the community to discuss the environmental impacts, and attendance was much larger than I expected. People were genuinely concerned about preserving the base population, which was the highlight of their annual festival. The tide of public opinion was beginning to turn. 2 weeks later, the DNR released their preliminary findings, confirming what Daniel had discovered. The area around my dock was indeed a critical spawning ground for spotted bass. Based on this determination, the DNR issued a special protection order for the upcoming spawning season, which coincided with the annual fishing festival. The protection order prohibited all fishing and construction activities within 500 feet of the spawning area, which included virtually the entire lakefront owned by the HOA, except for the area around my dock, which was designated as a minimal impact zone due to its long-standing presence. The community was in shock. The fishing festival, their 40-year tradition in the highlight of the summer, might have to be canceled. Eleanor quickly organized a community meeting, attempting to place the blame squarely on my shoulders. "If Mr. Turner hadn't interfered, we would be celebrating our festival as planned," she told the crowd. "His vindictive actions against the HOA have affected all of you." But this time her words didn't have the intended effect. Director William Foster from the DNR was present and clarified the situation. "The protection order isn't the result of anyone's complaint," he explained. "It's based on our scientific assessment of a critical wildlife habitat. If anything, we should thank Mr. Turner for bringing this to our attention. Without proper protection, the base population could have been seriously damaged by construction and increased fishing pressure, potentially harming the lake ecosystem for years to come. Henry and other longtime fishing enthusiasts stood up to support this view, explaining the importance of protecting the spawning grounds for the long-term health of the fish population. If we damage the breeding grounds now, there won't be any bass left for future festivals, Henry pointed out. The community was divided. Some residents still blamed me, while others began to question Eleanor's leadership and the rushed pier project that had never undergone proper environmental review. The revelation about Eleanor's business connection to the construction company raised even more eyebrows. Seeing an opportunity to resolve the conflict, I offered a solution. I would allow community members to use my dock for access to the parts of the lake still open for fishing during the festival if the HOA would remove the fence blocking my access and acknowledge my legal rights to the dock. Eleanor immediately rejected my offer, calling it blackmail, but her refusal only served to alienate more community members who saw a reasonable compromise being dismissed out of hand. At a particularly tense community meeting, Victor Ramirez finally stood up. "Enough, Eleanor," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "We're losing our fishing festival, the pride of our community for 40 years, just because you can't admit you were wrong." Eleanor flushed with anger. But before she could respond, Harold Schmidt, the oldest member of the HOA board, took the microphone. "I propose a vote of no confidence in our current HOA president," he announced, sending whispers rippling through the room. And that's when I realized the game had completely changed. The vote of no confidence caught Eleanor completely off guard. She had grown so accustomed to unchallenged authority that she hadn't noticed how many residents had become disillusioned with her leadership. The meeting descended into chaos, with Eleanor attempting to declare the vote invalid, while more residents demanded to be heard. Meanwhile, Cynthia Davis, a reporter from the local newspaper who had been tipped off about the controversy, published an article revealing Eleanor's business relationship with the construction company and questioning the transparency of the HOA under her leadership. The article included quotes from former board members and contractors who described a pattern of favoritism and selective enforcement of rules. The DNR expanded their investigation and discovered other environmental violations that had occurred under Eleanor's leadership, including unauthorized shoreline modifications and improper chemical treatments of lake weeds near her property. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board scheduled a formal vote on Eleanor's leadership. Diana Foster, a new resident and environmental attorney, stepped forward as a candidate for the position, promising transparency and a more collaborative approach to community governance. The vote was decisive. Eleanor was removed from her position as HOA president, with Diana elected in her place. One of Diana's first actions was to approach me with a peace offering. The HOA would remove the fence blocking access to my dock, acknowledge my legal rights to maintain the dock, and issue a public apology for the harassment I had faced. In return, I agreed to open my dock for community use during the fishing festival, which could proceed in a limited capacity using the areas not protected by the DNR order. I also offered to help develop a more environmentally sound plan for a community fishing pier that wouldn't impact the spawning grounds. The DNR approved a new plan. The community fishing pier would still be built, but in a different location that wouldn't affect the spawning area. The pier would be smaller than originally planned, but would include educational signage about lake ecology and responsible fishing practices. As Diana and I shook hands in front of the community, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor standing in the corner of the room, her eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," I could read from her lips. And true to my prediction, the very next morning, all HOA board members received a letter from Eleanor's legal team. She was making her final move. Eleanor hired an impressive team of lawyers from Anderson, Reynolds, and Hall, a prestigious firm from the nearest city known for representing corporate clients in high-stakes disputes. They filed a 27-page lawsuit against both the HOA and me personally, alleging illegal collusion, sabotage of a public project, tortious interference with business relationships, and a host of other legal-sounding complaints. The lawsuit demanded not only Eleanor's reinstatement as HOA president, but also $750,000 in damages, an astronomical sum that sent shockwaves through our community. The legal documents were delivered by a stern-faced process server who seemed to take particular pleasure in handing them to Emma and me during our Saturday morning breakfast. She rallied a small group of supporters, mostly people who had economic interests in the original Pier project or longtime allies who benefited from her favoritism. They began holding regular strategy meetings at Eleanor's lakefront home, their cars parked ostentatiously in her circular driveway for everyone to see. They created a Save Our Lake committee that distributed flyers claiming the fishing festival tradition was in danger because of extremist environmental positions and outside interference in community affairs. Some of the rhetoric bordered on personal attacks with vague references to newcomers who don't understand our community values. Thinly veiled references to me. The lawsuit claimed that the environmental concerns were exaggerated and that I had manipulated the DNR investigation to serve my personal vendetta against the HOA. The legal filings included affidavits from two out-of-state expert witnesses, a retired biology professor and an environmental consultant, who questioned Daniel's findings without having visited the site themselves. The documents suggested that I had somehow coerced or bribed DNR officials, though they offered no evidence for this outrageous claim. She sought to be reinstated as president and demanded significant monetary damages, including compensation for emotional distress and damage to professional reputation. The lawsuit created immediate practical problems. Our homeowner's insurance initially refused to cover legal defense costs, claiming HOA disputes were excluded from our policy. The newly elected HOA board was paralyzed with indecision about how to respond, with some members suggesting they should settle just to avoid the legal expenses. It was a moment of crisis that threatened to undo everything we had accomplished. Walter came out of retirement to help the new HOA board and me deal with the lawsuit. He arrived at our emergency meeting carrying a battered leather briefcase filled with neatly organized notes and precedent cases. Despite his age, his legal mind was still razor sharp. "She's desperate," he explained as we reviewed the legal documents, his finger tracing the ornate legal language with practiced ease. "This is a classic SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate and drain resources, not to win on legal merits. These types of suits are increasingly frowned upon by the courts, and some states have even enacted anti-SLAP legislation to prevent them." He pulled out several similar cases where courts had dismissed such lawsuits and awarded attorney's fees to the defendant. "We don't just play defense here," he said with a determined gleam in his eye. "We file for immediate dismissal and countersue for abuse of process." The case was assigned to Judge Catherine Miller, a 62-year-old jurist known for her strict adherence to environmental law. At the initial hearing, Eleanor's lawyers presented their case with theatrical flair, painting me as a vindictive newcomer determined to disrupt community traditions for my own benefit. When our turn came, Walter calmly presented evidence of Eleanor's business relationships with the construction company, the environmental impact reports, and documentation of the selective enforcement of HOA rules under her leadership. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested she wasn't buying Eleanor's narrative. Meanwhile, Eleanor attempted to convince some residents that the fishing festival would be permanently canceled if she wasn't returned to power. She held meetings at her home, spreading misinformation about the DNR's findings and my intentions. However, as the facts of the case became public through the court proceedings, even her most loyal supporters began to distance themselves. The courtroom was packed on the day Judge Miller issued her ruling. "The court finds no merit in the plaintiff's claims," she stated firmly. "In fact, the evidence suggests that it was the actions of the HOA under Ms. Blackwood's leadership that were potentially illegal, including failure to conduct required environmental assessments and apparent conflicts of interest in contracting practices." The judge dismissed the case entirely and referred the matter of Eleanor's business relationships to the County Ethics Committee for further investigation. Eleanor sat stone-faced as the ruling was read, her final gambit having failed completely. As we left the courthouse, Eleanor's remaining supporters abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with what was now clearly a lost cause. The community had seen her true colors, and there was no coming back from that. The fishing festival took place as planned, though in a modified format that respected the protected spawning areas. The transformation from crisis to celebration was remarkable. Diana and the new board worked tirelessly to redesign the event, consulting with the DNR to establish clear guidelines for water activities. Colorful buoys marked the protected areas, and volunteers in kayaks gently redirected any boats that strayed too close. Community members used my dock as a launching point. We set up a scheduling system to avoid overcrowding, and Emma created a welcoming station with refreshments and information packets about the lake's ecology. Families lined up each morning, fishing gear in hand, excitement on their faces. Children ran up and down the dock while parents chatted and prepared their tackle. To everyone's surprise, the fishing was extraordinary that year, with the spawning areas protected. The mature bass were more active in the open waters, leading to record catches and some truly impressive trophy photos. The event turned out to be one of the most successful in years, with participation numbers actually higher than previous festivals despite the restricted areas. There was a new element to the festival: educational presentations about lake ecology and sustainable fishing practices, which proved surprisingly popular, especially with younger participants. Daniel and his university colleagues set up interactive exhibits showing underwater footage of the spawning grounds, microscopes revealing the fascinating microorganisms that form the base of the lake's food chain, and demonstrations of proper catch and release techniques to minimize stress on the fish. What had begun as a controversy had transformed into an opportunity for community education and enhanced appreciation for the lake that was central to their community identity. The DNR completed their investigation and found that Eleanor had deliberately misrepresented environmental reports in the past. She faced civil penalties and was required to fund restoration work in areas of the shoreline that had been improperly modified during her tenure. Under Diana's leadership, the HOA adopted more transparent rules and a more respectful approach to homeowners' rights. The new board established a clear process for project approvals, including requirements for environmental reviews when appropriate. I became something of a local hero, not because I had stood up for my own rights, but because my actions had ultimately protected the lake and brought about positive change in the community governance. Even those who had initially opposed me came to recognize that the outcome benefited everyone. 1 year later, the base spawning grounds were thriving, and the interaction between the community and their environment had become more harmonious. The new fishing pier was built in an environmentally appropriate location and included educational displays about the lake ecosystem. I hosted a barbecue at my dock with most community members attending. The fence that had blocked my access was long gone, replaced by a tasteful walkway that the new HOA had installed as a gesture of goodwill. Word spread that Eleanor had sold her house and moved to another state. As I sat on my dock, watching neighbors and friends enjoying the party, I couldn't help but feel a bit grateful to Eleanor. Not because she had tried to take away my dock, but because that confrontation had ultimately brought about a better community. Victor raised his glass to me from afar, and Walter smiled proudly. Sometimes fighting for what's right isn't just about keeping what belongs to you. It's about helping others recognize the value of standing together against injustice. And if you're watching this video and facing a bullying HOA or any other unfair power, remember, sometimes all it takes to change a system is one person willing to say no. Drop a comment below if you'd like me to share details about your legal rights when facing an overreaching HOA. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HOA Unleashed for more stories about how I deal with bullies every day in my life. Thanks for watching.